Robert Keane, a humble, aging veteran, visits a bank to withdraw money. He is wrongly accused of being a fake veteran by an arrogant manager and teller. He just wanted to help his grandson with tuition. He walked in quietly, carrying nothing but a worn coat, a faded hat, and a heart full of memories. But by the time he left, the world inside that bank had changed forever. There's a kind of quiet strength we rarely see these days. It doesn't post on social media. It doesn't demand recognition. It just shows up, keeps promises, and disappears without applause. This is the story of a man named Robert Keane. But more importantly, this is a story about how society sometimes forgets its heroes, until they're reminded in the loudest, most unforgettable way. Robert wasn't there to make a scene. He wasn't flaunting medals or demanding attention. He simply needed to access an old account, one he hadn't touched since the days his hands held rifles instead of canes. But institutions, as we know, sometimes measure worth by appearance. When Robert stepped up to the counter, wearing his Korea/Vietnam veteran cap and clutching his discharge papers, the young teller laughed quietly. The manager, slick and smug, made a mockery of his documents, doubting their authenticity. "This looks like it was typed on a dinosaur," the manager smirked. "Escort him out," he ordered. A brass challenge coin, revered in military circles, was dismissed as a trinket bought online. Not everyone laughed. The spark of reverence. Not everyone laughed. While most eyes in Summit Ridge National Bank had turned toward the scene with amused smirks or uncomfortable glances, one pair of eyes didn't waver in mockery. They sharpened in recognition. Maya Rodriguez, standing near the customer service desk, held her phone loosely in one hand, her eyes narrowing as they caught the faint glint of brass sliding across the counter. A coin, a very particular coin. It wasn't just a military token, it was a bishop-level challenge coin, engraved with a thunderbird and 7 stars. To civilians, it might have looked like a trinket, maybe a collector's item purchased online. But to Maya, who had spent 7 years in the Air Force as a logistics officer, embedded in high-clearance operations, that coin might as well have been a thunderclap in the middle of a quiet room. She'd only seen one like it before, years ago in an underground strategy briefing in Germany. The colonel who carried it didn't even speak. He simply placed the coin on the table, and every officer in the room rose silently. No introductions, no preamble, just reverence. It was one of those coins, the kind you didn't earn. You were entrusted with it. And now it sat momentarily ignored on a bank counter in front of an aging man in a weathered coat and fraying cuffs. Maya stepped forward, not hurriedly, not dramatically, just purposefully. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor, cutting through the soft murmur of nearby conversations. She didn't look at the security guard or the teller, both of whom still wore the uneasy expressions of people who had committed to something they now doubted. Instead, she walked directly up to the counter, locked eyes with the manager, Caden, and spoke in a voice low enough not to be theatrical, but sharp enough to slice through the lingering air of skepticism. "You just made a mistake," she said. Caden blinked, the condescension faltering for the first time. "Excuse me." She turned her head slightly, gesturing toward the elderly man now sitting silently by the window, hands folded in patient dignity. "That man isn't a fake," she said. "That coin alone outranks every paycheck in this building." Caden scoffed, trying to regain footing. If he's so important, why isn't someone here with him? But Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply stepped outside, pulled her phone from her coat, and dialed a number only a handful of people in her circle knew. Her fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with focus. She didn't explain the scene. She only said what needed to be said. "He's here. Summit Ridge. Bishop Coin." And hung up. Unbeknownst to most in the bank, another set of eyes had also been watching. Older, quieter, and more seasoned than even Maya. In the far corner of the back office, behind a cracked glass partition and years of accumulated files, sat Harold Mertens. He wasn't a manager or even someone who appeared on the org chart anymore. Harold was a lifer, someone who had worked at the bank since it first opened on the converted land that used to be a military command base. His job title had changed over the years: records, compliance, community relations, but his memory remained impeccable. And when he heard the name Robert Keane, his hand paused on the paper he was filing. Slowly, reverently, he turned in his chair and looked up at the wall. There, nestled between framed awards and faded branch photographs, hung a large brass dedication plaque, one that most of the younger employees had never noticed, in honor of Summit Ridge Command and the officers who served. Among the names engraved in solemn permanence, one remained untouched by time or tarnish: Colonel R.J. Keane. Harold stood. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the wall, eyes lingering on the plaque, as if greeting an old ghost. He didn't need to question. He didn't need to confirm. He knew. He picked up the secure phone, the one usually reserved for rare banking alerts or high-priority federal flags. The line was old but direct. He dialed a memorized 6-digit access code. There were no pleasantries. When the other end clicked on, he said only, "It's Bishop Coyne, Summit Ridge. He's here." The person on the other end didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. And just like that, a chain of unseen loyalties began to activate, quietly, efficiently, and with the gravity only known to those who had once served in silence and shadows. Within 10 minutes, 2 separate military installations had received coded alerts. One colonel retired, now teaching ethics at a war college, set down his lecture notes mid-sentence. Another, stationed in D.C., forwarded a flagged image to a restricted archive. Background checks reversed, legacy files reopened, protocols initiated. Maya stood outside the bank, phone by her side, her breath steady. She looked back through the glass, her gaze fixed on the man now sitting alone, a figure of calm against a world that had momentarily forgotten what he represented. She didn't know the full story yet. She didn't need to. The coin had spoken for him. And somewhere down the highway, tires screeched as a black SUV cut across traffic, its destination no longer a matter of logistics, but of honor. Because sometimes the smallest gesture, the placement of a coin on a counter, can echo louder than any voice. And in rooms where service still holds weight, that echo is never ignored. Justice in motion. 30 minutes later, a black SUV surged across lanes of late afternoon traffic. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, and no advance warning, only the unmistakable presence of authority that didn't require announcement. Major General Everett Kane was en route. His face was carved from stone, jaw locked with the kind of tension that only men who've held battle plans and folded flags in the same lifetime could understand. He wore his uniform like armor, every button precise, every ribbon earned, not displayed. Kane wasn't a man who indulged in ceremony, but when he received the call with just 3 words, "Bishop Coyne, Summit Ridge," he didn't hesitate. He closed his leather briefing folder, stood up in the middle of a strategic command session, and turned to his aide without a hint of explanation. "Suit up. We're leaving." The aide, a sharp and capable lieutenant colonel in his own right, didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The phrase Bishop Coyne hadn't passed through operational channels in years, and the name Robert Keane had only been spoken in classified briefings or whispered reverently in officer academies. Keane wasn't just a name and a record. He was a doctrine, a principle, a legacy. Kane owed him everything. Back when Kane was a young officer, ambitious, eager, reckless, it was Colonel Robert J. Keane who had pulled him aside after a failed logistics simulation and offered the kind of mentorship that didn't show up in evaluations. Keane had handed him a worn copy of a field handbook annotated with decades of quiet wisdom. Strategy, Keane had said, isn't about looking smart. It's about staying invisible until it matters. And now that very man, one of the last living architects of Joint Force Protocol, had been publicly dismissed, mocked in a civilian bank, accused of being a fraud in a building constructed on the blueprint of his former command. Kane's hands clenched inside his leather gloves as the SUV barreled forward. This wasn't about personal loyalty anymore. This was about the erosion of memory. The way people forgot that peace was built on the shoulders of those who kept silent about the wars they'd survived. As the driver turned off the freeway and sped toward Summit Ridge, Kane stared out the tinted window. His reflection merged with the passing cityscape, modern glass towers and digital billboards. None of it would have stood without men like Keane, who had drafted the invisible lines of defense long before public opinion ever caught up. He didn't come to shout. He didn't come for headlines. He came because when a man like Keane is disrespected, you don't respond with press releases. You show up, and you make everyone remember. When the doors of Summit Ridge National Bank burst open, silence followed. Keane didn't have to shout. He simply walked in, approached the man no one believed, and saluted. "Colonel Robert Keane," he addressed him. Loud, clear, intentional. The room froze. Keane rebuked the staff. "You doubted a man who wrote the recon protocols your military still uses? You questioned documents that built the systems you profit from today." Then, Keane laid a folder on the counter. Classified documents, historical records, and a scan of the very plaque with Robert's name on it. Evidence of everything the bank had just denied. Robert didn't ask for this. In fact, all he wanted was to help his grandson pay for college. He folded the receipt quietly, the same way he had folded orders decades ago. But General Keane wasn't done. He gave Bobby a small velvet box. Inside, a long overdue medal engraved with 3 words, "Service Beyond Record." At Keane's invitation, everyone stood and saluted, not by command but by instinct. No cameras followed him, no interviews aired, but something changed inside that bank. Later that week, beneath the existing plaque, a new line was engraved. Robert J. Keane, Colonel, U.S. Army, Honor and Silence. It didn't explain the event. It didn't name the general. But those who saw it would remember.